In a corner of the world where few humans had ever set foot, deep in the dense, untamed jungles of Southeast Asia, life moved at its own mysterious rhythm. Towering trees, some hundreds of years old, stretched their limbs high into the sky, creating a thick green canopy that allowed only slivers of sunlight to touch the forest floor. Vines twisted and curled around ancient trunks, and the air was heavy with the smell of wet earth, blooming flowers, and the faint tang of distant rivers. The jungle was alive in every sense. Every rustle, chirp, and whisper seemed to carry a secret that humans had yet to uncover. For centuries, this jungle had been home to a unique species that no human had properly documented or studied. They were small, elusive creatures. Unlike anything found in the known animal kingdom, the local villagers had known about them for generations. They spoke in hushed tones about the creatures, describing them as mysterious and clever, almost like little guardians of the forest. They said the species had bright, intelligent eyes that seemed to watch and understand everything, even the humans who dared to enter their territory. The villagers told stories of strange behaviors, how these creatures could move silently through the thick undergrowth, appear and disappear without a trace, and sometimes leave small, curious signs of their presence, like objects arranged in patterns or marks on the ground that no one could explain. To the villagers, these creatures were more than animals. They were intelligent beings, something between the natural world and the unexplained, deserving respect and caution. Despite these local accounts, the outside world knew almost nothing about them. Scientists were aware that parts of the jungle were largely unexplored, but no formal study had been undertaken to learn about the species' behavior, diet, or social structure. Occasionally, rumors or blurry photographs made their way to research institutions, sparking curiosity among biologists and conservationists. Some dismissed these reports as exaggerations, perhaps the result of overactive imaginations or local folklore. Others, however, were intrigued. Could this be a completely new species, one that had somehow avoided human contact for so long? The possibility of discovering an entirely unknown creature fascinated them. Over time, small scientific expeditions began to arrive in the region. Their first encounters were cautious and often frustrating. The jungle was dense and treacherous, full of hidden rivers, deep mud pits, and sharp-edged plants. Navigating it required skill, patience, and sometimes luck. The creatures themselves seemed equally cautious. They rarely revealed themselves, preferring to observe from a distance. Scientists would set up cameras and tracking devices, hoping to capture proof of the species, but often these attempts yielded only glimpses of fleeting shadow, a pair of glowing eyes, or a rustle in the undergrowth that vanished before anyone could approach. The few close encounters that did occur were extraordinary. Scientists reported seeing the creatures move with a grace and intelligence that went beyond instinct. They seemed to understand human presence, sometimes avoiding it deliberately, sometimes appearing curious but cautious. One researcher described watching a small group of them gather near a stream, examining human-made tools left behind by the expedition, and then carefully moving them aside, almost as if they understood the purpose of the objects but chose not to interfere. The intelligence displayed was remarkable for such small beings, and it challenged many assumptions about the limits of animal cognition. At the same time, the creatures were highly social. Observations suggested that they lived in tight-knit groups, communicating through a combination of sounds, gestures, and subtle signals. They cooperated in ways that hinted at problem-solving abilities, working together to gather food or avoid dangers. This social complexity made them even more fascinating to scientists. They were not merely surviving, they were thriving, developing intricate behaviors that spoke of a long evolutionary history untouched by human interference. Yet, despite all the interest and curiosity from scientists, the species remained enigmatic. Their behaviors were unpredictable, and attempts to study them more closely often failed. They could disappear in an instant, leaving no trace behind. It was as if the jungle itself conspired with them, hiding them from human eyes, preserving their secrets. This unpredictability added to their mystique, fueling both scientific intrigue and popular fascination. Documentaries and reports described them as forest ghosts, small beings that existed on the edge of human perception, always watching but never fully revealing themselves. The environment itself played a role in their mysterious existence. The jungle was a world of constant motion and adaptation. Seasons brought heavy rains that swelled rivers and created temporary waterfalls, while dry spells transformed the forest floor into a maze of sunlit clearings and shadows. The creatures had adapted to every nuance of this environment. They were expert climbers, capable of moving through trees with incredible agility. They could swim when needed and navigate the thick undergrowth silently. Every aspect of their anatomy and behavior seemed perfectly attuned to the demands of their habitat, making them highly resilient in a world where survival required constant vigilance. Humans, however, were not part of this balance. To the creatures, humans were unpredictable intruders, sometimes harmless, sometimes dangerous. For centuries, the species had avoided direct contact, learning from experience which humans were a threat and which could be observed safely. They seemed to understand boundaries, respecting those who showed caution and retreating from those who imposed force. This ability to gauge human behavior suggested an advanced awareness, one that went far beyond simple instinct. Despite their intelligence and adaptability, the species had lived quietly for generations, untouched by the wider world. The jungle had remained a sanctuary, a place where they could exist without fear of mass interference or exploitation. This peace, however, was fragile. Human curiosity was growing, and with curiosity often came intrusion. Scientists and explorers were drawn to the jungle not only by the promise of discovery but also by the potential for fame, recognition, and even financial gain. The presence of an unknown intelligent species was a powerful motivator, one that could easily outweigh caution or respect for the creature's autonomy. It was during this period of growing human interest that the first signs of tension appeared. The creatures, previously cautious but passive, began to exhibit subtle behaviors indicating unease. Cameras were tampered with, observation equipment was mysteriously moved or disabled, and the creatures occasionally approached human camps at night, leaving objects arranged in deliberate patterns. These signs were not aggressive, but they were unmistakable a message that the species was aware of the intrusions and was capable of responding in its own way. Locals tried to warn outsiders, recounting centuries of knowledge about the creatures. They spoke of respecting the forest, moving quietly, and never attempting to capture or control the beings. Many scientists dismissed these warnings at first, seeing them as superstition or fear of the unknown. Yet, the repeated incidents, vanishing equipment, strange tracks, and unexplainable disturbances began to change minds. Even the most skeptical researchers had to admit that these creatures were not ordinary animals. They were intelligent, aware, and capable of influencing their environment in ways humans did not yet understand. As interest in the species grew, so did the stakes. Researchers wanted to study them more closely, but the creatures were not easily studied. Every attempt to interact had to be carefully calculated. Mistakes could endanger both the humans and the species itself. It was a delicate balance, one that required patience, respect, and humility, qualities that were not always present in those who ventured into the jungle. For the creatures, life continued as it always had, but the intrusion of humans introduced a new, unpredictable variable. Their world, once isolated and safe, was becoming entangled with human ambition and curiosity. The jungle, once a sanctuary, was slowly transforming into a stage for events that neither humans nor creatures fully understood. And so, the last species that had lived in harmony with its environment began to experience the first, real stirrings of conflict that, unknown to anyone at the time, would eventually lead to tragedy in this fragile, vibrant world. The creatures moved with intelligence and grace, always alert, always watching, and always surviving. They were the hidden witnesses of a changing age, the last species to remain untouched by human recklessness, yet poised at the threshold of a collision that would test their resilience in ways they had never faced before. The jungle held its breath, the trees whispered, and the creatures, curious, intelligent, and mysterious, continued to live their secret lives, unaware that soon, everything would change forever. For centuries, the small, mysterious creatures had lived in harmony with the dense, green jungle. Their lives were simple yet complex in their own way. They had food, shelter, and a community that looked after one another. But as time went on, their peaceful existence began to face a new and unprecedented threat. Humans, unlike the villagers who had lived alongside the forest for generations, these outsiders had no respect for the delicate balance of life that existed there. They saw the jungle as a place full of resources to exploit, an untapped frontier where profit and discovery outweighed caution and respect. It began subtly at first. Small groups of scientists, eager to study the creatures, ventured deeper into the jungle. They set up observation posts and left cameras to capture images of the elusive beings. Some of the creatures noticed these changes immediately. At first they reacted with curiosity, watching the humans from a distance, studying their strange behaviors. They seemed to understand that the humans meant no immediate harm, but the presence of these intruders disrupted their quiet routines. What had been an untouched sanctuary was now an area of constant surveillance and intrusion. Then bigger and more aggressive human forces arrived. Multinational companies saw the jungle not as a home to extraordinary life, but as a land full of potential wealth. Trees that had grown for centuries were marked for logging. Rivers were examined for their mineral deposits, and large swaths of land were cleared for development. That humans did not care about warnings from local villagers or scientists. They did not consider that the creatures had survived in this jungle for centuries, because they understood it in a way humans never could. Every chainsaw, every bulldozer, and every loud campfire disrupted the natural order and frightened the creatures. The creatures tried to adapt. At first, they avoided areas where humans were active, moving quietly to new parts of the jungle. They became more secretive, more elusive. Groups that had once been visible during the day retreated into the dense shadows, emerging only at night when human activity slowed. They changed their hunting patterns, their routes through the trees, even the places they slept. The jungle, which had once been predictable, now required constant vigilance. The creatures had to learn the humans' behaviors, their schedules, and even their methods of exploration. Humans, however, were relentless. They did not understand the creatures' intelligence. They saw the jungle as a puzzle to solve and the creatures as obstacles or curiosities. They left traps, sensors, and barriers in the forest, trying to capture proof of the species' existence. At first, these attempts failed. The creatures were clever and cautious, avoiding every trap and outsmarting every human contraption. But over time, the humans grew impatient and frustrated. Their curiosity turned to irritation. Some researchers began to push boundaries, stepping into areas they were warned to avoid, leaving the creatures little choice but to react. As the humans encroached further, the creatures began to display behaviors that no human had seen before. They started to interfere with human equipment in small but deliberate ways. Cameras would be knocked over, sensors disabled, and paths blocked with branches and debris. It was not random, it was organized. Groups of creatures appeared to communicate, coordinating their movements to send clear messages to the humans. They were not just surviving, they were resisting, using intelligence and strategy to protect their home. Locals who had long respected the forest tried to warn the newcomers. They spoke of the creatures' cleverness, their ability to remember faces, and their dislike of intrusion. They said that if humans did not act with caution and respect, the consequences could be serious. But many outsiders ignored these warnings, that they considered the stories exaggerated or fanciful. For them, science and profit were more important than folklore and wisdom. They did not see the creatures as intelligent beings. They saw them as obstacles to be managed or curiosities to be studied. The situation escalated when the creatures began to test human limits. Small incidents grew larger. Equipment that had been left alone would suddenly malfunction in ways humans could not explain. Paths through the forest would become impossible to navigate, with fallen trees or rearranged rocks blocking progress. At night, some humans reported hearing strange sound scores and cries that seemed almost like warnings. Lights would flicker mysteriously near camps, and supplies would disappear or be moved. These events were unnerving, creating a sense of unease among the teams that had come expecting simple observation and research. As tension grew, some humans began to respond aggressively. They set up traps and barriers to catch or control the creatures. They attempted to corner them, thinking they could outsmart a species that had survived hundreds of years in the jungle. But the creatures were far more cunning than expected. They seemed to anticipate human moves, adapting quickly to any new threat. Every attempt to capture them failed, and with each failure, human frustration and fear grew. The jungle, once a quiet sanctuary, became a battlefield of wits. Though only one side truly understood the stakes, it was not just humans versus creatures. It was humans versus the very ecosystem. Every intrusion damaged the forest in ways humans did not immediately notice. Soil was compacted by machinery, small plants were destroyed, and natural water channels were altered. This affected the creatures' food supply and living spaces, forcing them into smaller, more confined areas. They were fighting not only to protect themselves but also to maintain the balance of their environment. They adapted, yes, but every change brought new risks, both for themselves and for the humans who did not understand the jungle's intricate systems. Scientists, some of whom genuinely wanted to learn and observe, began to recognize that they were dealing with something extraordinary. The behaviors they were witnessing could not be explained by instinct alone. The creatures were not simply reacting, they were planning, strategizing, and communicating in ways humans had not anticipated. One team reported finding evidence of coordinated group actions where multiple creatures worked together to interfere with human equipment without causing direct harm to themselves. Another team noted patterns in the creatures, movements that suggested an understanding of human psychology. They could anticipate where humans would go, how they would react, and even what mistakes they might make. Despite this intelligence, the creatures were not looking for conflict. They were acting defensively, responding only when their home and safety were threatened. Their goal was survival, not destruction. But humans misinterpreted these defensive measures as aggression. Reports in media and scientific journals began describing the species as dangerous or vengeful, and the narrative shifted. What had started as curiosity and scientific interest was turning into fear and hostility. The creature's clever resistance was being framed as a threat, fueling the belief that they needed to be controlled, captured, or eliminated at the same time. The creature's intelligence became their greatest asset and their only protection. They learned to manipulate their environment in ways humans could not easily counter. They used camouflage, natural barriers, and even decoys to mislead and confuse intruders. They moved silently and observed carefully, ensuring they stayed one step ahead. Their ability to adapt and respond to human actions kept them alive, even as the jungle itself changed under the pressure of logging, exploration, and development. This period marked the true rising challenge for the species. They were no longer merely surviving, they were navigating a world increasingly dominated by humans. Every day brought new risks, loud noises, unfamiliar smells, and constant intrusion. Every attempt by humans to study or control them threatened their existence. Yet, through it all, they persevered, using their intelligence, agility, and coordination to protect themselves. Their survival depended on their ability to remain elusive, to communicate silently, and to anticipate human actions before they happened. By the end of this period, the creatures had made their presence felt in a subtle but unmistakable way. Humans could no longer enter the jungle with impunity. Their equipment failed, their plans were disrupted, and their sense of control was challenged. For the first time, the humans realized that they were dealing with a species that was not only intelligent but also capable of resisting and responding in unexpected ways. The balance of power, though delicate, had shifted. The jungle was no longer a passive backdrop, it was a living, strategic environment, and the creatures were its silent, vigilant guardians. The stage was set for what would come next. The intrusion of humans had awakened a force the world had underestimated. The creatures, once hidden and unchallenged, were now fully aware of the threat. They had learned, adapted, and prepared in their own quiet ways. Humanity, eager and impatient, had begun to push the boundaries, unaware of the intelligence, cunning, and determination of the beings they sought to study. The challenge had risen, and with it, the tension, the fear, and the inevitability of confrontation. The jungle, once a peaceful sanctuary, had become a proving ground for a species fighting not just for survival, but for respect, dignity, and the right to exist without interference. As human presence in the jungle grew, the tension between the mysterious creatures and the outsiders reached a critical point. For years, the creatures had observed humans carefully, adapting to their movements, avoiding traps, and responding defensively without provoking direct conflict. Yet, humans were persistent, driven by curiosity, ambition, and sometimes greed. The delicate balance that had allowed the creatures to survive was about to shift dramatically. The turning point began when a large, well-funded scientific expedition arrived in the jungle. Unlike previous teams, this group had advanced technology, heavy equipment, and a singular determination to document and capture the creatures for study. They set up permanent observation posts, installed high-tech cameras, and placed tracking devices in strategic locations. For the creatures, this was unlike anything they had encountered before. The subtle disturbances that had been manageable now became constant pressures. The forest that had once provided safety and camouflage was now filled with alien noises, lights, and smells, and their space was shrinking with every new device and human footprint. At first, the creatures responded with caution. They avoided the areas of highest activity, moving deeper into the jungle, taking refuge in places that humans rarely entered. They've altered their routines, feeding and hunting at different times, and relying on the densest parts of the forest for protection. But the humans did not relent. They cleared paths, cut through undergrowth, and forced the creatures into closer contact. What had once been a cautious game of observation was now a direct challenge to the creatures' survival. The first major incident that marked the turning point occurred when several researchers attempted to corner a group of the creatures near a river. The creatures had anticipated this move. They worked together to sabotage the humans' plans without revealing themselves fully. Rocks were displaced to make paths treacherous. Small branches fell in ways that alarmed the humans, and subtle signals led the team astray. The researchers were confused and frustrated. Their technology, which had never failed before, began to malfunction in ways that were hard to explain. Equipment was lost, cameras were toppled, and sensors gave false readings. It was clear that the creatures were not only aware of the humans' presence, they were actively countering it. This display of intelligence shocked the humans. They had expected to document and observe, perhaps even capture the creatures, but the animals' strategic responses forced them to reconsider their approach. For the first time, many began to understand that they were dealing with beings who could plan, adapt, and communicate in ways humans had not anticipated. Yet, this awareness came too late to prevent escalating tension. Some team members interpreted the creature's cleverness as aggression. Fear began to replace curiosity, and discussions shifted from observation to control. Plans were made to trap and contain the creatures, rather than coexist or study them peacefully. Meanwhile, the creatures continued their defensive strategies. They began leaving signs and messages that humans could not easily interpret. Patterns of rocks, disturbed foliage, and subtle markings in mud or sand were placed deliberately near campsites. These were not random. They were warnings, signals to maintain distance. Yet the humans often misread these signs. Instead of recognizing them as communication, they saw them as challenges or threats. The creatures, in their intelligence and caution, were trying to avoid direct confrontation, but humans, in their impatience, were forcing the issue. The situation escalated further when some humans attempted to capture the creatures. Nets were set, cages prepared, and baits laid. The creatures, however, anticipated these moves. Small groups would distract the humans, drawing their attention away from traps, while others dismantled or avoided them entirely. Some incidents left humans with minor injuries, scratches, bites, or falls, but nothing fatal. Still, these encounters were enough to spread fear. Rumors of aggressive creatures circulated in scientific circles and local communities, increasing the pressure on authorities to act decisively. At the same time, the jungle itself seemed to respond to the increasing human intrusion. Paths became harder to navigate, rivers swelled or changed course during heavy rains, and natural obstacles multiplied. The creatures used every advantage the environment offered. They led humans into confusing or dangerous terrain, using the landscape as a shield and a weapon. Their knowledge of the jungle was unparalleled. Every tree, river, and hidden path was familiar to them, and they moved through it with unmatched agility. Humans, by contrast, were slow, noisy, and vulnerable. Every step into the jungle became a calculated risk. The turning point reached its dramatic peak one night when a small team of researchers disappeared without a trace. They had been exploring deeper than usual, attempting to track a group of the creatures they believed to be isolated and vulnerable, but the creatures had anticipated their movements. Evidence later suggested that the researchers were misled, separated, and guided into areas of dense undergrowth and difficult terrain. No direct violence occurred, but the team became trapped, disoriented, and unable to communicate with their base. After hours of searching, the researchers managed to find their way back, shaken and terrified. Their equipment had been sabotaged, cameras destroyed, and paths blocked in ways that could not be explained by natural causes alone. This incident marked a clear realization for the humans. The creatures were not passive, they were aware, adaptive, and capable of strategic thinking. From that point onward, the relationship between humans and the creatures changed. Scientists who had once approached with curiosity now approached with caution. Local villagers, who had long understood the forest and its inhabitants, were vindicated in their warnings. Humans began to recognize that this was no ordinary species. They were intelligent, observant, and capable of resisting intrusion in ways that could have serious consequences. The turning point was not marked by violence but by a profound shift in understanding. The creatures had shown that they were not to be underestimated, and any further attempts at domination or exploitation would carry risks beyond simple control measures. The turning point also revealed the limits of human arrogance. Despite technology, planning, and manpower, humans were unable to fully control or predict the creatures' behavior. Their presence in the jungle, intended to observe and study, was now causing disruption for both themselves and the species they sought to understand. For the creatures, survival required constant vigilance, creativity, and collaboration. For humans, survival required humility, patience, and a willingness to accept that not everything could be measured, mapped, or controlled. In the aftermath of these incidents, scientists began to debate the ethics of their actions. Should they continue their attempts to study and capture the creatures, knowing the risks involved? Could they coexist, or had human intrusion already escalated beyond the point of reconciliation? Some argued for retreat, recognizing that their presence endangered the species and themselves. Others argued for more aggressive measures, seeing the creature's intelligence as a threat to human authority. The debate highlighted a deeper tension: humanity's desire to understand and dominate versus the creature's right to exist peacefully in their own environment. The creatures, for their part, continued to navigate the jungle with skill and intelligence. They learned from every human action, adapted to every new challenge, and coordinated in ways that ensured their continued survival. They were no longer merely avoiding humans, they were actively shaping their environment to protect themselves. Every move was calculated, every action deliberate, and every decision influenced by centuries of living in harmony with the jungle. They had risen to the challenge, not through aggression but through intelligence, cooperation, and strategic thinking. By the end of this turning point, it was clear that the balance of power had shifted. Humans had assumed control through technology, planning, and numbers, but the creatures had proven that knowledge of the environment, intelligence, and adaptability could outweigh brute force. The turning point was a moment of awakening, both for humans and for the creatures. Humans began to understand that they were not the dominant force they had believed themselves to be. The creatures had shown that they could resist, adapt, and survive despite unprecedented challenges. This period set the stage for the events that would follow. The turning point was not an isolated incident, but a culmination of years of careful observation, adaptation, and strategic response. It marked the moment when the creature's intelligence became undeniable, when humans realized that simple curiosity could not explain their behavior, and when the jungle itself became a complex battlefield of wits, endurance, and survival. The stage was now set for the ultimate confrontation, one that would test the limits of both human ambition and the creature's resilience in ways no one could have anticipated. The creatures had risen to the challenge, and in doing so, they had changed the course of history in the jungle. Their intelligence, patience, and adaptability had transformed them from quiet observers into strategic actors, capable of influencing events far beyond what humans had expected. The turning point was not merely a moment of conflict, it was a revelation. It revealed the depth of the creature's abilities, the fragility of human assumptions, and the immense power of a species perfectly attuned to its environment. From this moment on, the story would no longer be one of simple observation. It would be a struggle for survival, understanding, and the right to exist in a world increasingly dominated by humans. The tension that had been building for years in the dense green jungle reached its breaking point. The creatures, small yet intelligent, had survived centuries largely undisturbed. But human intrusion had escalated to a level that could no longer be ignored. Scientists, explorers, and even commercial interests had brought heavy equipment, traps, and advanced technology, all in the name of study or exploitation. What had started as cautious observation had now become aggressive intrusion. The creatures, who had long preferred to remain hidden and avoid confrontation, were forced into a situation where they had to act decisively to protect their home and their species. The climax began with a massive, coordinated operation by humans, the largest effort ever mounted to capture or eliminate the creatures. This team included dozens of researchers, local guides, and security personnel, equipped with nets, cages, drones, and sophisticated tracking devices. Their plan was to move systematically through the jungle, corner the creatures, and either study them in captivity or remove them entirely from the area. The humans believed that their numbers, organization, and technology would be more than enough to overcome the clever but small animals. They had underestimated both the creatures' intelligence and the extent to which the jungle itself could be used as a weapon. From the creatures' perspective, this was a matter of survival. They had already witnessed the consequences of human intrusion: habitats destroyed, paths blocked, and food sources threatened. They could no longer rely on avoidance. They needed to act. Using their deep knowledge of the terrain, they orchestrated a defense that was as strategic as it was silent. Groups of creatures coordinated to lead humans into traps of their own making. Fallen trees, thick undergrowth, and natural obstacles were cleverly used to confuse and delay the intruders. At night, they moved silently through the jungle, observing and anticipating the humans' every move. Every action was calculated, designed to protect themselves while minimizing direct confrontation. The humans began to realize that the creatures were far more intelligent than they had anticipated. Early in the operation, teams found their carefully laid traps disabled or destroyed, nets had been cut, cages had been overturned, and monitoring equipment had gone missing. Drones were rendered ineffective as creatures guided them into dense canopies, where cameras could no longer see. The humans' initial confidence began to fade, replaced by frustration and fear. They had assumed that intelligence and technology would guarantee success, but the creatures were proving that knowledge of the environment, teamwork, and quick thinking could easily outmatch brute force. The first major encounter occurred at a clearing near a river, where a small group of humans had set up a base camp. The creatures had watched the camp for days, learning the humans' routines, shifts, and patrol patterns. On the night of the encounter, the creatures struck indirectly. They manipulated the environment in ways that caused chaos logs fell to block entrances. Smoke from fires drifted into tents, and carefully placed branches stripped anyone who tried to move stealthily. Humans were injured, not fatally, but enough to create panic. They began to question whether they truly understood the jungle or the beings they had come to capture. It was the first clear demonstration that the creatures could control the situation, using intelligence and the natural terrain to their advantage. As the operation progressed, the humans attempted to tighten their grip, pushing deeper into the jungle, setting traps in areas the creatures had avoided for decades. But the creatures adapted immediately. They split into smaller groups, luring humans into false paths while other groups dismantled or evaded traps. Some humans became separated from the main team, only to find themselves trapped in dense thickets or guided toward natural hazards. The jungle itself seemed to be alive with the creature's presence, turning against the intruders in subtle, yet effective ways. It was a war of strategy, wits, and survival rather than one of sheer strength. During these encounters, the humans realized that their presence had made the creatures far more resourceful than anyone had expected. They had underestimated not only the creatures' intelligence but also their ability to communicate, plan, and coordinate across distances. Groups of creatures were observed moving in patterns that suggested silent signaling and collaboration. They anticipated human moves, predicted reactions, and even seemed to learn from mistakes made by the humans earlier in the operation. The humans' sophisticated technology, which had initially given them confidence, was now being turned against them in ways they could not fully comprehend. In a pivotal moment, a group of humans attempting to capture creatures near a riverbank found themselves surrounded. The creatures had orchestrated the environment, using natural barriers and misdirection to create confusion. Waterfalls, mud pits, and dense undergrowth acted as defensive tools, channeling the humans into areas where they could not easily maneuver. The humans were disoriented, equipment malfunctioning, and communication lines failing. It became painfully clear that the creatures were not only defending themselves but doing so with precision, intelligence, and strategy. The humans had assumed control, but the jungle and its clever inhabitants had flipped the balance. The turning of events also exposed human vulnerability. Despite superior numbers and technology, they could not match the creatures' intimate knowledge of the forest. Every attempt to force an encounter ended in frustration, injury, or failure. Exhaustion set in as days of relentless pursuit yielded little progress. Morale began to collapse, and even the most confident members of the operation realized that brute force alone could not succeed. The creatures, small and seemingly fragile, had demonstrated resilience, intelligence, and adaptability far beyond expectations. Eventually, the humans were forced to retreat from certain areas. Some teams abandoned their equipment, leaving cages, traps, and supplies behind. The creatures had effectively won control of their territory, yet their victory was bittersweet. The intrusion and confrontation had caused damage to their habitats, disrupted food sources, and stressed the community. The jungle itself bore scars from the struggle. Fallen trees, altered pathways, and disturbed soil served as a reminder of the battle that had taken place. While the creatures survived, the cost was high, highlighting the fragility of their existence in the face of human interference. In the final stages of the conflict, attempts by humans to regroup and mount another operation were abandoned. Reports indicated that the creatures had become even more cautious, moving deeper into parts of the jungle humans could not access. The last remaining groups disappeared from observation zones, leaving behind only signs of their presence: tracks, rearranged foliage, and subtle signals in mud or sand. Humans, exhausted and defeated, realized that the creatures were no longer accessible or controllable. The operation was a failure, a dramatic demonstration of intelligence, adaptability, and strategic thinking in a species humans had once considered insignificant. The climax of this story is not one of destruction but of revelation. The creatures, through skill, cooperation, and knowledge of their environment, had defended their home against the most powerful forces humans could bring. They had turned a confrontation into a lesson for humans about the limits of technology, the value of intelligence in unexpected forms, and the consequences of arrogance. Their actions were precise, measured, and purposeful, never reckless, never violent without cause, but always effective in achieving their goal: survival and the protection of their home. In the aftermath of the confrontation, humans reflected on the experience with a mix of awe, fear, and humility. The creatures had proven that intelligence and strategy could rival brute force. Scientific papers and media reports acknowledged the creatures' extraordinary capabilities, sparking debates about ethics, conservation, and the responsibilities humans had toward species they did not fully understand. Local communities, who had long respected the creatures, felt vindicated. Their warnings and knowledge had been ignored for years, yet now it was clear that their understanding of the jungle and its inhabitants had been accurate all along. The resolution was a hard-earned recognition of the creatures' strength and intelligence. Humans were forced to retreat and accept that they could not dominate or fully control this species. The creatures had survived, but the encounter had also shown their vulnerability. Human interference, even when unintentional, had consequences for their survival and the health of the jungle ecosystem. The story of this climax became a cautionary tale about the limits of human ambition, the power of intelligence in unexpected forms, and the fragile balance between species that share a common environment. This moment marked the end of one chapter in the relationship between humans and the creatures, but it was not the end of the story. While the creatures had successfully defended themselves, the encounter had left scars on the land, on their communities, and in the minds of humans who had witnessed their intelligence firsthand. The climax was both a victory and a warning. Survival requires adaptation, strategy, and respect, and intelligence comes in many forms, often in ways humans are slow to recognize. The jungle, once a silent observer, had become an active participant in the story, shaping the outcome in favor of those who knew it best. By the conclusion of this period, it was evident that the creatures were no longer just passive inhabitants of the jungle. They were active defenders of their home, capable of influencing events far beyond what humans had expected. The climax had demonstrated the full extent of their abilities: intelligence, cooperation, foresight, and adaptability. Humans had learned, at great cost, that domination was not guaranteed, and that respect, understanding, and humility were essential when dealing with forces and beings beyond their comprehension. The resolution was not merely about survival. It was about a profound shift in perception. Humans had seen firsthand the consequences of intrusion, and the creatures had proven their capacity to respond, adapt, and prevail. The balance of power had been tested and reaffirmed in favor of those who were truly attuned to the jungle, the creatures who had lived in harmony with it for centuries, who understood every nuance of the terrain, and who had used their intelligence to protect everything they held dear. After the intense confrontation between humans and the creatures, the jungle fell into a heavy, tense silence. The operation, which had been the largest human intrusion in the area's history, was over, but the consequences lingered. Humans had retreated, their technology abandoned, and their confidence shaken. The creatures had survived, but their world had changed. The lush forest that had been their sanctuary was scarred by the events of the conflict. Fallen trees, trampled undergrowth, and disrupted waterways bore witness to the struggle, and for the creatures' life would never return entirely to what it had been before. Despite the chaos, the creatures began to rebuild their lives. They moved carefully through the affected areas, restoring pathways, reclaiming hunting grounds, and re-establishing territories that had been disrupted by human activity. Even though they had defended themselves successfully, the jungle reminded them that their environment was fragile. Every scar left by humans, whether it was a fallen tree or a patch of disturbed earth, required adaptation. The creatures demonstrated remarkable resilience, using their intelligence not only to survive but also to heal and protect the ecosystem they depended upon. For humans, the aftermath was a time of reflection, fear, and awe. Reports circulated in scientific journals, local communities, and media outlets describing the creatures' intelligence, strategy, and adaptability. Stories of how humans had been misled, trapped, and outsmarted by small beings that had once seemed insignificant captured public imagination. Scientists admitted that they had underestimated the creatures at every level. They had assumed that technology, numbers, and planning would be enough to dominate and study the species. Instead, they had encountered beings that challenged their assumptions, forcing them to rethink everything they believed about intelligence, adaptation, and survival. Local villagers, who had known about the creatures for generations, were both vindicated and saddened. They had long warned outsiders about the creatures' cleverness, their ability to observe, anticipate, and communicate, yet few had listened. Now, their stories were confirmed by evidence, tracks, altered landscapes, and observations of clever behavior. They recognized that the creatures had fought not out of malice but out of necessity to defend their home, their community, and their very way of life. There was pride in this recognition, but also a solemn understanding that human interference had created risks that had not existed before. In scientific and conservationist circles, the event sparked heated debates. Could humans ever interact with such species ethically? Should the creatures remain protected in isolation, or was it inevitable that humans would continue to push boundaries for the sake of study and profit? Some argued that humanity had learned a vital lesson about humility, the dangers of assuming dominance over creatures whose intelligence and adaptability exceeded expectation. Others feared that this lesson might be temporary, that human curiosity and ambition would once again lead to intrusion, with consequences that could be even more destructive. The creatures themselves seemed to understand that they had survived a pivotal challenge. Their behaviors became more cautious and strategic. They reinforced their awareness of the jungle, strengthening social bonds, and teaching younger members how to navigate not only the environment, but also the growing threat of humans. Knowledge that had once been instinctual became more deliberate. They had learned from direct confrontation how to anticipate human actions, how to defend territory without unnecessary risk, and how to adapt in ways that maximized survival while minimizing conflict. Their intelligence had been tested under extreme pressure, and they had proven their resilience. For the humans who had witnessed the events firsthand, the jungle became a symbol of respect and caution. Many researchers abandoned attempts to capture or dominate the creatures, recognizing that survival and observation required a new approach, one based on non-intrusive methods, patience, and humility. Scientific priorities shifted from exploitation to understanding, from interference to preservation. Humans were no longer the unquestioned controllers of the environment. There were visitors, learners, and sometimes intruders who needed to measure every action carefully. The aftermath also highlighted the fragile balance of ecosystems. The creatures' survival depended not just on their intelligence but on the integrity of their environment. Human activity had damaged food sources, disrupted water channels, and created obstacles that the creatures had to navigate. This period demonstrated the interconnectedness of life. Harming one aspect of the ecosystem had immediate and far-reaching consequences for the species that lived within it. Conservationists began using this case as a study in the importance of preserving natural habitats, emphasizing that survival was not only a question of individual species' ability but also of the environment's resilience. Stories of the creatures spread beyond scientific circles, inspiring awe, fear, and reflection. Documentaries, articles, and folklore began to intertwine, painting the creatures as symbols of intelligence, strategy, and survival against the odds. They became a reminder that human assumptions of superiority were often misplaced, and that the natural world could harbor beings whose abilities exceeded human comprehension. In schools, research institutions, and conservation programs, the creature's story became a lesson in respect, humility, and ethical responsibility. Humanity was reminded that power was not absolute and that coexistence required understanding rather than domination. For the creatures, the lessons of the confrontation would resonate for generations. The young members of their community learned from the adults who had faced humans directly. Knowledge about human behavior, traps, and strategies became part of the communal understanding. They learned to communicate threats, avoid danger, and use their environment in ways that minimized risk while ensuring survival. Their culture, intelligence, and adaptability were strengthened, creating a lineage that would remember the confrontation as a defining moment in their history. The jungle itself seemed to reflect the aftermath. Over time, plants regrew, rivers returned to their natural courses, and the forest began to heal from human intrusion. Yet, the marks of the conflict remained subtle but persistent, serving as reminders of the fragility of the ecosystem. The creatures continued to thrive in this environment, but they did so with heightened awareness. They had survived because of intelligence, adaptability, and cooperation. But they had also learned that the peace they had once taken for granted was fragile and needed vigilance. Humans, too, carried the memory of this confrontation. The scientists who had witnessed the creature's intelligence firsthand became advocates for ethical interaction with nature. Some dedicated their lives to studying the jungle without interference, using observation methods that respected the creature's autonomy. Others became storytellers, spreading the lessons learned to wider audiences. The confrontation had become a turning point in human understanding, teaching that intelligence, strategy, and adaptability existed in many forms, and that even the smallest beings could challenge human assumptions and power. Reflection on the events also brought a profound ethical realization. Humans recognized that their intrusion had endangered a species, not through malicious intent but through impatience, curiosity, and ambition. They learned that respect for life, especially intelligent life, required humility, restraint, and foresight. It was a lesson about the consequences of interference, the responsibilities that come with knowledge, and the limits of human authority. In this reflection, the story of the creatures became more than a tale of survival. It became a symbol of the delicate balance between species and the importance of ethical coexistence. Over time, the story of the creatures inspired new ways of thinking about conservation. Policies were introduced to protect their habitat, restrict human intrusion, and monitor environmental health without direct interference. The creatures became living symbols of resilience, intelligence, and strategic survival. They reminded humans that intelligence was not unique to their species, and that understanding required patience, observation, and respect rather than control and domination. The lessons learned in the aftermath extended far beyond the jungle, influencing approaches to conservation, scientific research, and even cultural attitudes toward other forms of life. The creatures continued to thrive, but they did so in a world forever changed by humans. Their survival was a testament to their intelligence, adaptability, and the careful strategies they employed during the confrontation. They had endured against overwhelming odds, using knowledge of the environment, coordination, and cleverness to protect themselves and their home. The humans who witnessed their resilience were left with a mixture of admiration and humility, recognizing that the jungle and its inhabitants were forces to be respected, not conquered. Ultimately, the aftermath was a story of learning, reflection, and adaptation. The creatures had survived, but they had also taught humans invaluable lessons about intelligence, strategy, and the fragile balance of ecosystems. Humans had been forced to reconsider their assumptions, their methods, and their ethics. The creatures had protected their home not through violence or brute strength, but through patience, cunning, and deep understanding. And in doing so, they left a lasting legacy, a reminder that coexistence, respect, and awareness of the natural world are not optional, but essential for survival. Even years after the confrontation, the jungle remained a place of mystery and wonder. The creatures moved silently through the trees, watched by humans only from a distance, their intelligence intact and their home preserved. The story of their survival became legend, a tale told across generations as a warning and a lesson. Humans remembered the events not as a simple victory or defeat, but as a profound encounter with a species that had challenged them, outsmarted them, and endured where many thought they could not. It was a story of respect earned, lessons learned, and the enduring power of life that refuses to be underestimated. In the end, the creatures and their jungle continued to thrive, a testament to the strength of adaptation, intelligence, and cooperation. Humans had intruded, disrupted, and learned, but they had also been humbled. The aftermath of the confrontation was more than survival. It was reflection, education. Both species had been changed by the encounter, but the jungle and its clever, resilient inhabitants had endured, leaving humanity with a story to remember, respect, and learn from for generations to come.